8,000 enemy troops, one complete division with armor, artillery, air defense, and logistics, trapped in rapidly collapsing pockets surrounded by American forces. 72 hours from encirclement to complete surrender, ending entire enemy campaign that military planners predicted would require months of sustained operations to defeat. What American army accomplished wasn't just tactical victory encircling large enemy force. It was operational masterpiece where single encirclement operation achieved strategic effects. Doctrine says require destroying enemy capabilities through prolonged attrition. But the reason why 72-hour siege forced surrender of 8,000 troops ending broader campaign has nothing to do with overwhelming American firepower or complete destruction of encircled force. It was one psychological operation that convinced trapped division their situation was hopeless, while simultaneously convincing enemy command that attempting relief would result in additional forces being encircled, creating cascading collapse of enemy will to continue fighting. And understanding how that psychological operation actually worked requires waiting for revelation that changes everything about modern siege warfare and the role information operations play when physical destruction isn't objective, but breaking enemy will to fight determines outcomes. Just weeks ago, American forces launched offensive operation against enemy defensive positions that intelligence assessed would require sustained combat to penetrate. Enemy possessed capable division with 8,000 troops holding strategic terrain that conventional assault would require weeks of fighting, accepting significant casualties. American operational planning didn't emphasize frontal assault, but maneuver operation exploiting enemy disposition, weaknesses intelligence had identified. Rather than attacking enemy strength, American forces would maneuver around enemy positions, creating encirclement that would trap division without requiring direct assault against prepared defenses. That approach required operational tempo, moving forces faster than enemy could reposition, creating fait accompli, where enemy found themselves surrounded before they could withdraw. Maneuver warfare doctrine emphasizes such operations, but executing against capable opponent requires intelligence about enemy positions, rapid movement capability, and enemy command being slow recognizing threat until encirclement is completed. Welcome to the Navy Chronicle, where modern warfare meets operational excellence. Hour 0. American mechanized forces began rapid advance exploiting gaps in enemy defensive positions. Movement wasn't broad front assault, but concentrated thrusts designed to penetrate deep into enemy rear areas. Enemy forces detected American movements, but assessed them as reconnaissance or limited attacks, rather than recognizing operational level maneuver creating encirclement. That misassessment provided critical hours where American forces advanced without encountering coordinated resistance. By time, enemy command recognized scope of American operation. Forward elements had already established positions, blocking enemy withdrawal routes. Enemy division holding forward positions suddenly found themselves cut off from supporting forces and supply lines. Standard procedure would be attempting withdrawal before encirclement completed, but enemy hesitated, attempting to hold positions rather than conducting tactical withdrawal that would abandon strategic terrain their defense was supposed to protect. Hour 24. Encirclement was complete. American forces controlled terrain surrounding enemy division, creating pocket approximately 20 kilometers across. Enemy possessed 8,000 troops with armor and artillery, but limited supplies because forward positioning had depended on supply lines. American maneuver had severed. Standard siege doctrine has besieging force, either assaulting encircled enemy accepting casualties or maintaining containment while attriting defenders through artillery and airstrikes. American approach was different. Rather than physically destroying encircled force, psychological operations would convince enemy that resistance was futile and surrender was only rational choice. That psychological approach required enemy believing their tactical situation was hopeless, relief was impossible, and continued fighting would result in complete destruction without achieving any objectives. Creating that perception required information operations as important as military pressure. Hour 48. Psychological operations intensified. American forces broadcast messages into pocket describing encircled division situation, emphasizing they were surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement, facing overwhelming American force, and that continued resistance would result in unnecessary casualties. Messages weren't propaganda making empty threats. They were accurate descriptions of tactical situation, designed to make encircled troops recognize reality they faced. Additionally, American forces conducted demonstrations, dropping leaflets showing maps of encirclement, conducting artillery fires and airstrikes against military targets, demonstrating American capability, but explicitly avoiding maximum destruction that would have been possible if objective was annihilating encircled force. Those demonstrations communicated message that Americans possessed capability to destroy division, but were offering opportunity for surrender, preventing unnecessary casualties. That approach created psychological pressure, where continued resistance seemed futile, while surrender appeared rational choice, preserving lives without achieving any military objectives through fighting. But here's where operation reveals what American psychological approach was actually accomplishing beyond just targeting encircled division. Remember how messages emphasized relief was impossible and attempting rescue would result in additional forces being encircled. Those messages weren't just targeting trapped troops, they were targeting enemy command structure, deciding whether to attempt relief operations. American psychological operations were conducted knowing enemy leadership would intercept communications intended for encircled troops. Messages describing encirclement and impossibility of relief were designed as much for enemy command as for trapped division. When enemy commanders monitored American broadcasts describing encirclement, they received detailed information about American dispositions, capabilities, and intentions that would inform their decision-making about whether attempting relief was feasible. American psychological operations were deliberately providing intelligence to enemy command, but intelligence describing situation where relief appeared impossible, creating psychological effect at operational level, where enemy command would choose not attempting relief, because American information operations convinced them relief would fail, resulting in additional losses. Hour 60. Enemy command faced decision about whether attempting relief. Conventional military logic says commanders should attempt rescuing encircled forces, even accepting risks, because abandoning division without attempting relief destroys morale across entire military. But American psychological operations had created situation where enemy command possessed detailed information provided by Americans through broadcasts ostensibly targeting encircled troops, indicating relief would be catastrophic failure. Enemy commanders analyzed information Americans had provided through psychological operations, concluding that attempting relief against American forces who demonstrated ability to rapidly maneuver and encircle would likely result in relief forces being encircled alongside trapped division. That assessment wasn't just enemy analysis, it was conclusion American psychological operations had deliberately engineered by providing information designed to make relief appear impossible. Enemy command decided not attempting relief, preserving forces that would be lost in failed rescue. That decision meant encircled division was truly isolated, not just physically but also psychologically, because they now knew their command had abandoned them to fate. Hour 72. Encircled division surrendered. 8,000 troops laid down weapons and submitted to American custody, ending operation. Surrender wasn't result of being completely destroyed. Division retained significant combat power and could have continued fighting if they'd believed resistance served purpose. But psychological operations had convinced encircled troops their situation was hopeless, relief wasn't coming, and continued fighting would result in destruction without achieving objectives. Rational calculation was surrender preserved lives while resistance served no purpose, because tactical situation was untenable and strategic situation had been decided by their command's choice, not attempting relief. American forces achieved surrender of 8,000 enemy troops through 72-hour siege that emphasized psychological pressure over physical destruction. Strategic assessment concluded encirclement and surrender ended enemy campaign. Because loss of complete division and circumstances of surrender, abandoned by their command and convinced resistance was futile, destroyed enemy will to continue broader operations. Campaign that should have required months of fighting ended, because single encirclement operation achieved psychological effects that made continued resistance appear hopeless to enemy forces throughout theater. Now for revelation about American psychological operations that proved so decisive. Remember how broadcasts were designed to target both encircled troops and enemy command simultaneously? Those operations weren't developed during siege improvising messages based on tactical situation. They were result of detailed intelligence preparation, where American planners had studied enemy command culture, decision-making processes, and psychological factors influencing enemy choices about fighting versus surrendering. Intelligence analysis had concluded enemy commanders prioritized preserving forces over attempting risky relief operations if relief appeared likely to fail. That intelligence enabled designing psychological operations specifically targeting enemy command decision-making, providing information that would make relief appear impossible. Additionally, intelligence about encircled divisions' morale and cohesion indicated they would surrender if convinced resistance was futile and relief wasn't coming. American psychological operations were intelligence-enabled targeting, specifically designed to exploit enemy psychological vulnerabilities. Messages weren't generic propaganda but precisely crafted communications, exploiting intelligence about how enemy commanders and troops would respond to specific information under siege conditions. Think about implications for siege warfare and psychological operations. American forces achieved surrender of 8,000 troops through operations emphasizing psychological effects over physical destruction. Conventional siege doctrine emphasizes attriting defenders until surrender becomes inevitable through casualties and supply exhaustion. American approach achieves surrender through information operations, convincing enemy their situation was hopeless. That psychological approach requires intelligence enabling understanding enemy decision-making and designing operations exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. Physical military pressure remained important. Encirclement had to be real and demonstrations had to prove American capabilities. But decisive factor was psychological pressure, making continued resistance appear pointless. Future siege operations can potentially achieve similar effects when intelligence enables psychological operations targeting enemy will to fight rather than requiring physical destruction of combat power. For enemy forces, operation revealed vulnerability to psychological operations exploiting their command culture and decision-making processes. Enemy division was defeated not through being destroyed, but through psychological operations, convincing them resistance was futile. Enemy command's decision not attempting relief was influenced by American information operations, deliberately providing intelligence designed to make relief appear impossible. Future enemy operations must account for possibility opponents possess intelligence, enabling psychological operations, exploiting decision-making vulnerabilities. Defending against such operations requires either cultural changes in how decisions are made, difficult and potentially degrading to combat effectiveness, or accepting risk that opponents might understand decision-making well enough to influence choices through information operations. Neither solution addresses fundamental challenge that effective military operations require decision-making processes that can become vulnerabilities when opponents understand them sufficiently to exploit through psychological operations. For American military, Operation validated intelligence-enabled psychological operations as decisive capability in siege warfare. Understanding enemy psychology enabled designing operations, achieving surrender without requiring physical destruction. Future American doctrine will likely emphasize psychological operations, integration with conventional military pressure. Recognizing combination creates effects neither alone can achieve. Success also demonstrated value of intelligence collection, focused on understanding adversary psychology and decision-making processes. That intelligence enabled operational planning, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities through information operations, precisely targeting enemy responses. But success was specific to enemy whose psychology and decision-making intelligence revealed. Future operations require similar intelligence preparation specific to each adversary, rather than assuming psychological approaches that worked once will work universally against different opponents with different psychological profiles and decision-making cultures. Which factor dominated this operation? A. American military superiority in firepower and maneuver. B. Poor enemy tactical decisions and command failures. C. Intelligence-enabled psychological operations precisely targeting enemy command decision-making and encircled force morale, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, intelligence analysis had identified. The answer is C. American military capabilities mattered, enabling encirclement and maintaining pressure. Enemy made some tactical errors but fought professionally within their constraints. Decisive factor was psychological operations designed through intelligence analysis to exploit enemy vulnerabilities, convincing encircled troops resistance was futile and enemy command relief was impossible. 8,000 troops surrendered, ending entire campaign because psychological effects achieved through information operation broke enemy will to fight. Success demonstrated intelligence-enabled psychological operations can achieve strategic effects through targeting adversary psychology when operations are precisely designed, exploiting specific vulnerabilities intelligence has identified. Can adversaries defend against such psychological operations? Yes, but with difficulty. Defending requires understanding own psychological vulnerabilities and decision-making processes that opponents might exploit. That requires honest self-assessment. Military organizations often resist. Additionally, defending requires discipline, resisting information adversaries provide, even when information appears accurate and useful. Enemy command's decision not attempting relief was influenced by American information operations that provided seemingly accurate intelligence about situation. Distinguishing between accurate intelligence and deception, designed to influence decisions, is extraordinarily difficult, especially under operational pressures. Most practical defense is assuming information adversaries provide might be designed influencing decisions and making choices based on independent assessment. But independent assessment requires intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities, enabling validating or contradicting information adversaries provide. Capabilities not all forces possess adequate to requirements. What does this mean for future siege operations? Psychological operations integrated with military pressure can achieve surrenders without requiring physical destruction when operations exploit intelligence about adversary psychology. Such operations require intelligence preparation, understanding enemy decision-making, and psychological vulnerabilities. Physical military capabilities remain necessary, providing pressure, making psychological operations credible. But decisive effects come through targeting enemy will rather than enemy capability. When psychological operations convince adversaries, continued resistance serves no purpose. Future doctrine must address integration of psychological operations with conventional military pressure, recognizing combination creates effects neither alone achieves. This operation demonstrated template where encirclement provides military pressure, while psychological operations targeting specific vulnerabilities create conditions for surrender. Success requires intelligence, enabling psychological operations design, but demonstrates potential achieving strategic effects through operational approaches, emphasizing psychology over destruction. This operation proved encirclement and psychological operations can achieve strategic effects, ending campaigns when operations target enemy will to fight rather than requiring physical destruction. 8,000 enemy troops surrendered, ending entire campaign through 72-hour siege, emphasizing psychological pressure over kinetic destruction. American intelligence-enabled psychological operations convinced encircled troops' resistance was futile, while convincing enemy command attempting relief was impossible. Surrender ended campaign because psychological effects destroyed enemy will to continue fighting. Success demonstrated intelligence understanding. Adversary psychology enables operational approaches, achieving strategic effects through targeting enemy decision-making and morale, rather than requiring sustained combat destroying enemy capabilities through prolonged attrition that conventional doctrine predicts. Future warfare requires addressing integration of psychological operations with conventional military pressure, recognizing intelligence-enabled information. Operations create capabilities, achieving effects. Physical destruction alone cannot match when operations exploit adversary psychological vulnerabilities, precisely targeting decision-making and will to fight. Subscribe to the Navy Chronicle, where modern warfare meets operational excellence, where American forces demonstrate intelligence-enabled psychological operations, achieve strategic effects through targeting enemy will to fight rather than requiring physical destruction, where 72-hour siege proves encirclement, combined with information operations, creates conditions for surrender ending entire campaigns, where 8,000 enemy troops surrender, demonstrates psychological operations, precisely exploiting intelligence about adversary decision-making, can achieve effects conventional military pressure alone cannot deliver, where future warfare requires understanding that decisive advantages increasingly come through targeting adversary psychology when intelligence enables operations exploiting specific vulnerabilities rather than assuming superior combat power alone, determines outcomes through physical destruction that prolonged campaigns require, achieving strategic effects conventional doctrine predicts.